Now, obviously, that airplane wasn't really there, but he had that big blank space in the sky and had to fill it with something. And he had all these biplane pictures. Must have been an air show near Detroit. And he'd taken these pictures, had to use them up somehow. You find these same biplanes in his pictures from Flint, Kalamazoo, Battle Creek, wherever he touched down for any length of time. Oh, this would be around 1910, I suppose. 1907 to 1910, maybe. No, this is from the Bug and Horsey days. Notice the water sprinkling wagon there, right in the middle, laying the dust on Main Street. Main Street by this time had been paved with bricks, great big heavy brick pavers. But the farmers came in from the sticks with a lot of dirt on the wagon wheels of their vehicles, and of course the old West Side was just dirt streets at this time. So all this dirt got carried onto Main Street, and they had to sprinkle it in the summertime to lay the dust. That's the Liberty Street intersection there behind the sprinkler wagon. The Singer Sewing Machine store, the S's in the windows there for singers. And right next to this rather ungainly building, you see at the left the home of Bertha Mulig. Does anybody here remember Mulig's dry goods store? There you go. Well, Bertie Mulig lived in this house right on Main Street. It was torn down in 1962 and replaced by the Stein and Gatz sporting goods store. Where this big ugly building stood, the Singer Sewing Machine store, this was the Marchese Brothers building. They tore this down and built a rather handsome storefront where Grinnell's was located for many years. And that building still stands. The little Detroit News vendor is gone, and the tall brick building beside it was for a long time the Wilkinson Luggage Shop at the right. Here we are at the south end of the business district on Main Street, looking north through the right-of-way of the trolley tracks. We had a trolley system that came up from the campus area along William Street, then went north on Main all the way to Catherine, where it jogged right, took a diagonal on Detroit Street down to the Michigan Central Railroad Depot. At first, it actually went down the hill that was there then. It was a more gradual hill than what's there now, of course. And it would stop and let passengers off right in front of the building now known as the Gandy Dancer. Well, one day in 1906, on an icy winter day, the rails were a bit slick, and the heavy steel trolley car got to the top of the hill and just slid right down and banged into the building. And after that, they wouldn't go down that hill anymore. And all the passengers who were bringing their luggage to the depot had to disembark at the top of the Broadway hill there and carry it down in the snow and the ice by hand, or have their servants do it. Likewise, when they got off the train, if they wanted to get on the trolley, they had to climb the hill first. Here's a lovely old shot of Main Street. Some of these black and white photographic cards are so sharp that you can enlarge the heck out of them and see more and more detail. Did you see that horse in the wagon there at the left? They were coming into town. I showed these slides once at the Grotto Club, and the daughter of the man driving that wagon recognized her father. I don't know how she did it. And his team of horses, which are shying away from the trolley car, which has just passed them. And they had a farm right out at the corner of Liberty and where Stadium is now. And that farm was in existence until recently. There's a huge veterinarian's office there now where their family barn used to stand. And if you go down the street a little farther north, you run into some familiar buildings and the names of stores, but I guess we can't get it big enough on this screen. In the far background is Ann Arbor's first skyscraper from 1907, the Glazier Building. It was built by the Cook Brothers Construction Company. And the story is that Mr. Cook, who supervised the construction, was an irascible man, lived in the Old West Side, and one day he was trying to supervise work several floors above him, and he shouted up the elevator shaft, "How many of you guys up there?" The answer came back, 3. And he shouted, "Half of you come down right now." Well, I guess they were stupefied. I don't know how they calculated that. Well, here we are. This is the picture that enlarges the previous scene. I forgot I'd done it photographically. There's the War Brothers shoe store. They were cousins of the War who ran the bookstore. And the trolley car is heading for the depot. But this is after 1907, so he's not going to crash into the side of the building this time. The trolley barns were on Wells Street, right across from Burns Park, the corner of Wells and Lincoln. Let's see, that would be the northwest corner. Here's a contrasting photo from the 1950s. Remember Cunningham's? You always save at Cunningham's. That was the slogan on the huge wall sign. And here's our second skyscraper, the First National Building from 1929. That was really a bad year to start a bank, but the First National Bank moved to that skyscraper in the first year of the Depression. A few years later, the First National Bank of Ann Arbor merged with the Farmers and Mechanics Bank and the other bank, what was it called? It's funny, I'm drawing a blank on the bank. Anyway, the 3 banks merged in 1936 as the Ann Arbor Savings and Commercial Bank. In 1942, the name was shortened just to Ann Arbor Bank. There's a much more gentle car, an open car from, this would be about 1908. This picture was done by a photographer who had a studio on Huron Street opposite the courthouse. You can see the tower of the old courthouse in the background looming over the Main Street buildings. The building on the immediate corner from around 1902 or so was the State Savings Bank. It's now covered by reflective glass. David Osler did that job a few years ago. So that homely building is no longer visible. Instead, it reflects the 2 buildings opposite across Main and across Washington Street, which are more interesting historic structures. One of them being, of course, the old Melig store. That open streetcar, that was a feature of the summer. We didn't have air conditioning back then, and it was a popular thing to get on this open car at night before going to bed and cool off by riding the complete circuit around the town. It was only a nickel, and you got a nice breeze. Well, I suppose I should explain, there was no central aisle on those summer cars, just benches across the entire width of the car. So you had to get on the running board and then walk along the running board until you found a space on a bench that you could occupy. The sign in there, which you cannot read, says baseball today at the fairgrounds. Well, the fairgrounds, of course, is now Burns Park. That State Savings Bank I just mentioned put out these little cards to advertise. Apparently they would send one a month. And I suppose they were supposed to appeal to little kids to put a dime in their savings account every month. Here we have April and May of 1912. On the other side of the street, there's Mulig's and Goodyear's, and I think there was a 5 and dime there at that time, antedating Woolworth's, which later occupied that store. I think the first 5 and dime was Kirby's. Kirby was a cousin of F.W. Woolworth, and at one point F.W. Woolworth decided that he wasn't going to allow all his relatives to open their own stores under their own names. They all had to be Woolworth stores. So Kirby vanished from the Main Street scene at that time. Oh, and in the background you notice the incomplete Glacier building, Key Bank as it is now. Across Huron Street from the Key Bank was the Masonic Temple. This was also known as the old Gregory House Hotel when it was built in 1862. And we knew it as the municipal court building in the 1950s and 60s. It burned down in about 1969, I think. There was a fire on the upper floor in the old Masonic Hall. The building was converted to the Masonic Hall, the upper stories anyway, in 1885 by Junius Beale, who acquired the building at that time. And he was a zealous member of several Masonic fraternities. Well, the thing burned down when a fire was started in the legal aid office overnight. Somebody had left an electric coffee pot plugged in and it short-circuited or something and started a fire which destroyed that magnificent building. And of course, we'd already forgotten how nice it looked because some idiot had put blue and white plastic paneling, rectangles, over the whole thing around 1961 or 2. And when it burned down 8 years later, everybody'd forgotten what it used to look like. This picture would be around 1910. Looks like an early automobile's parked there. Maybe the photographer's car. There's the same building at night with all the windows lit up. The Masons must have been having a jamboree that night. Well, this is a way of taking a prosaic scene and making it a little different to appeal to possible purchasers. The problem is that these cards, the photographs were sent to Germany. That's where the best color processes were in the early 20th century, and they could somehow print cards more cheaply than they could be printed in America. And so we got thousands and thousands of them printed in Germany, and of course there was a huge postcard craze in the first decade of the 20th century. Well, when you send a photograph to Germany and you instruct them to take this daytime scene and turn it into a night scene, make a dark sky and light the windows in the buildings, and I'm sure nobody told them to put the moon in the north sky, but they did it anyway. And that's how you got it there. Now we're down to the Ann Street corner. This is the southwest corner of Ann and Main. We're on Main looking at the building, the Whitney Hotel and the Whitney Theater. The theater is the big building at the back of the hotel where all the famous thespians used to play who came to Ann Arbor in the 19th century when it was Hill's Opera House, built in 1871. The hotel was added to and altered a bit later on, but the old Opera House was changed and became the Athens Theater around 1900. In 1911, B.C. Whitney from Detroit acquired it and turned it into the Whitney Theater. And it gradually declined. They weren't doing any more live shows by the 1940s and 50s when it became a B movie house and finally was torn down because the fire marshal declared it a fire trap. It was vacant for several years before it was destroyed. Yeah, the county jail, I think you can just barely make it out there in the far distance, the low building at the Ashley Street corner. The Whitney was torn down, I think, in 1954. This county jail was altered in 1927, and it was torn down in about 1975 when the new county jail was opened out on Hogback and Washtenaw. This was Harvey's last jail, the controversial sheriff of the 60s. I was going to mention, oh yes, the prisoners in the jail had a rather unwelcome habit of signaling their appreciation of the actresses who arrived at the stage door to play Shakespearean roles and whatnot. And they would whistle mightily when they found one that appealed to them. Here's a play at the Whitney, but we don't have any record of which play it was. It looks like a restoration drama, doesn't it, with the wigs and the long clay pipes. All the Michigan Union operas were staged at the Whitney originally. Well, across the street, of course, was the cynosure of every eye, the courthouse built in 1878, designed by a man named Bunting from Indiana. This was torn down more or less at the urging and the demand and the behest of longtime mayor of Ann Arbor, William E. Brown Jr., yes, that was it, was big for parking ramps and parking lots and parking meters and traveled all around the country urging parking systems. Well, his complaint about the old courthouse, glorious as it was built in the 19th century. He actually said this at a meeting downtown. He said that building was erected in the 19th century. Need I say more? Quote unquote. Well, apparently he didn't. The Board of Supervisors said, oh, no, it can't be that old. Let's get rid of it right now. Well, first they got rid of the tower. Somebody said, well, you know, that tower is awfully heavy. It's weighing down the building, and besides, nobody uses it for anything except that clock up there, which never tells the right time. Let's get rid of that. So they did. They got rid of that. And then it was a lot easier because the building didn't look like much without the tower. It was a lot easier to say, well, let's get rid of the rest of it now. And they did around 1955, 56. It was torn down and replaced by a modern, not very interesting building by Ralph Jurgenoff of Ypsilanti. Kind of Ypsilanti's revenge on Ann Arbor, I think, for having the county seat. Here's the old post office. Started out kind of small. It was built in 1909 and then enlarged in 1926. They just extended it to the south and redesigned the main entrance to be still in the center. This was one of the first buildings in town with a revolving door. Used to fascinate me when I was a kid. It was the corner entrance there on Catherine Street. I think this picture was taken by somebody actually standing on the marquee of the Whitney Theater and looking south. We see there in the background the bank building that was destroyed by the interurban freight in 1927. It had been designed or built in about 1896, and it just didn't last very long. For some reason, we don't have any real direct pictures of this old bank building. But here's one looking down looking east on Huron Street, and it shows the bank building off to the right. In the background is the Cook Hotel. That was a long-time watering hole. Started out as a temperance hotel, but gradually I think they changed over it and allowed beer and wine there. Notice the man in the foreground at the right. He seems to be wearing a bowl on his head, shading himself from the sun. I would swear that this was old Reuben Kempf, the musician. It looks an awful lot like him, has the same mustache. And he's clowning there for his friend, the photographer. The streetcar tracks you see beside him making a sharp turn to the right to Main Street. This is the branch that went through Ann Arbor along Packard up to Main, and then turned on to West Huron and went out Jackson Road to Jackson, Battle Creek, Kalamazoo, etc. Also on Huron Street, the next block down, was Eschelbaugh's Meat Market, or Eschelbach. This picture from 1905 shows the staff lined up behind the counter. Notice that there's a phone at each end of the counter. Ann Arbor had two competing phone companies. And a business, of course, to serve all its customers, had to subscribe to both phones. But they had to separate them physically so they could tell which one was ringing. This was a big nuisance until the phone companies were combined. Oh, I don't know, around 1910 or so. See the meat on the wall behind the distinguished gentleman on the clerical collar I think he's wearing. No, I understand the idea was that the housewife would take a long metal fork with her when she went to the butcher shop, and she would actually prod the carcasses of meat that were hanging on the wall to make sure that they hadn't deteriorated too much. Here's another view of the cookhouse from the other side. This is 4th Avenue corner. We have some pictures of William Jennings Bryan giving a speech from a podium set up in front of the cookhouse during the campaign of 1908. In the 1896 campaign, he was actually campaigning, giving speeches from the steps of the courthouse across the street. I've often wondered what that was. It does look like an outhouse annex. It probably was a convenience for people getting out of a carriage who didn't want to get wet in the rain, I imagine. Here we are around the corner, another block down on 4th Avenue, and we see the wonderful matched pairs of horses from Enoch Dieterle's undertaking parlors. See Enoch Dieterle's name on the building in the foreground at the left? Now we're back at the corner there where the bank was. And there were a lot of Italian and Greek confectioners and little restaurants in that block. Nothing there now. And this is what happened on the night of August 5th, 1927. A loaded freight train. They used to run freight trains on the urban tracks at night. They'd rumble right through Packard Street in downtown Ann Arbor, making a terrible racket, I'm told. My father remembered them. Anyway, one of them was anchored, this 3-car freight train was anchored up by Vets Park, the later fairgrounds, on the night of August 5th, 1927. And the brakes weren't set properly or something happened. And the man on board fell asleep. And the thing started to gradually roll down Jackson Avenue. And of course, at the forks, it met Huron Street. And that was no barrier. It kept on gathering steam and speed and power. And it wasn't even slowed down by the dip under the Ann Arbor Railroad trestle. And instead, it shot right up the hill again toward Main Street, was going far too fast to negotiate the sharp 90-degree curve, and it landed right in the bank. destroyed the building. The postmaster of Ann Arbor surveyed the damage the next day and was quoted in the paper. He was a member of the bank's board of directors. He said, "This is the largest deposit in the history of the Farmers and Mechanics Bank, and I hope we never have another one like it." Well, it was a dangerous business to be out on the trolley cars. This is a wreck near Ypsilanti. A photograph by A.S. Linden, who took numerous pictures of student activities at the University of Michigan in those days. Speaking of student activities, the Pretzel Bell was a popular hangout for students. One of them made this postcard, an original drawing. The Pretzel Bell on Liberty Street. This was Truby's Candy Store on Main Street. That's presumably Mr. Truby there himself. And it looks like they were expecting a party and nobody showed up. He's there all by himself with all those crepe paper streamers overhead. Maybe he was anticipating a later crowd. Hoppy took a very few photographs, and they're sort of enigmatic like this one. We're not sure exactly where this was. It looks a little bit like it might have been the front window of Hertler Brothers on Ashley Street. Notice that is not a real automobile, but they're doing a kind of a pastiche to promote the auto show in Detroit with puns. It says, "You auto, let us show you our wares. You won't get the runabout at our store," and so forth. Those wheels are garden hose, coils of garden hose. There's a ladder braced over them and a few odds and ends whatnots. A funnel looking like a car horn, I suppose. Somebody had fun with. We're going south on Main Street. We're coming to Washington Street again, looking the other way. And on the corner there where the First National Building later was erected is Hoig's Home Supply Store. People tell me that you could get anything you could imagine at Hoig's. Incidentally, the son of the Hoigs who ran the store was Jerry Hoig, who was the longtime manager of the Michigan Theater, and before that the Majestic Theater on Maynard Street. He must have died around 1980 or 85. Now we're off Main Street. This is on Washington, almost to State. The Dodge Brothers Motor Cars, Graham Brothers Trucks, R.H. Arbor, an advertising postcard. This later was the headquarters of Laura Ashley and the Talbots. I don't know who's in there now. I was in there once when Ed Pierce was running for Congress, and he made a speech to us there.